and welcome to South Suburban Missionary Baptist Church Midweek Moment. My name is Deacon LaVonn Traylor, and I will be your host for today. As we celebrate Black History Month, we want to continue to celebrate those who sacrificed their lives that we may have a better life today. On today, I'd like to talk about a young lady who, despite her stature and size, her education, and her mental health, was a record to be dealt with. The person I would like to share with you today is named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an escaped enslaved woman who became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading enslaved people to freedom before the Civil War, all while carrying a bounty on her head. But she was also a nurse, a Union spy, and a woman's suffrage supporter. Tubman is one of the most recognized icons in American history. Her legacy has inspired countless people from every race and background. Harriet Tubman was born around 1820 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her parents, Harriet Green, better known as Rit, and Benjamin Ross, named her Araminta Ross and called her Minty. Rit worked as a cook in the plantation's big house, and Benjamin was a timber worker. Araminta later changed her first name to Harriet in honor of her mother. Harriet had 8 brothers and sisters, but realities of slavery eventually forced many of them apart, despite Rit's attempt to keep the family together. When Harriet was 5 years old, she was rented out to as a nursemaid, where she was whipped when the baby cried, leaving her with permanent emotional and physical scars. Around the age of 7, Harriet was rented out as a planner to set muskrat traps and was later rented out as a field hand. She later said she preferred physical plantation work to indoor domestic chores. Harriet's desire for justice became apparent at age 12 when she spotted an overseer about to throw a heavy weight at a fugitive. Harriet stepped between the enslaved person and the overseer, and the weight struck her in the head. She later said about the incident, "The weight broke my skull. They carried me to the house, all bleeding and fainting. I had no bed, no place to lay down on at all, and they laid me on the seat of the loom, and I stayed there all day and the next." Harriet's good deed left her with headaches and narcolepsy the rest of her life, causing her to fall into a deep sleep at random. She also started having vivid dreams and hallucinations, which she often claimed were religious visions. She was a staunch Christian. Her infirmities made her unattractive to potential slave buyers and renters. In 1840, Harriet's father was set free, and Harriet learned that Ritz, her mother's owner's last will and testament had set Rit and her children, including Harriet, free. But Rit's new owner refused to recognize the will and kept Rit, Harriet, and the rest of the children in bondage. Around 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man, and changed her last name from Ross to Tubman. The marriage was not good, and the knowledge that 2 of her brothers, Ben and Henry, were about to be sold provoked Harriet to plan an escape. On September 17, 1849, Harriet, Ben, and Henry escaped their Maryland plantation. The brothers, however, changed their minds and went back. With the help of the Underground Railroad, Harriet preserved persevered and traveled 90 miles north to Pennsylvania and freedom. Tubman found work as a housekeeper in Philadelphia, but she wasn't satisfied living free on her own. She wanted freedom for her loved ones and friends too. She soon returned to the South to lead her niece and her niece's children to Philadelphia via the Underground Railroad. At one point, she tried to bring her husband John north, but he remarried and chose to stay in Maryland with his new wife. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act allowed fugitives, freed workers in the North to be captured and enslaved. This made Harriet's role as an Underground Railroad conductor much harder and forced her to lead enslaved people further north to Canada, traveling at night, usually in the spring or the fall when the days were shorter. She carried a gun for both her own protection and to encourage her people who may have had a change of mind to continue on. She often drugged babies and young children to prevent slave catchers from hearing their cries. Over the next 10 years, Harriet befriended other abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, Thomas Garrett, and Martha Coffin Wright, and established her own Underground Railroad network. It widely reported that she emancipated 300 enslaved people, including her elderly parents, and instructed dozens of others on how to escape on their own. She claimed, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet found new ways to fight slavery. She was recruited to assist fugitive enslaved people at Fort Monroe and worked as a nurse and cook. Harriet used her knowledge of herbal medicines to help treat sick soldiers and fugitives enslaved people. In 1863, Harriet became the head of an espionage and scout network for the Union Army. She provided crucial intelligence to the Union commanders about Confederate Army supply routes and troops, and helped liberate enslaved people to form Black Union regiments. Though just over 5 feet tall, she was a force to be reckoned with, although it took over 3 decades for the government to recognize her military contributions and reward her financially. After the Civil War, Harriet settled in her family. uh, After the Civil War, Harriet settled with her family and friends on a land she owned in Auburn, New York. She married a former enslaved man and Civil War veteran named Nelson Davis in 1869. Her husband John had died in 1867, and they adopted a little girl a few years later. Harriet had an open door policy for anyone in need. She supported her philanthropy efforts by selling her homegrown produces, raising pigs, accepting donations and loans from friends. She remained illiterate, but toured parts of the Northeast speaking on behalf of women's suffrage movement and worked with noted suffrage leaders like Susan B. Anthony. In 1896, Harriet purchased land adjacent to her home and opened the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigenous Colored People. The head injury she suffered in her youth continued to plague her, and she endured brain surgery to help relieve her symptoms. But her health continued to deteriorate, eventually forced her to move into her namesake rest home in 1911. Pneumonia took Harriet Tubman's life on March 10, 1913. Her legacy lives on. Schools, museums bear her name, and her story has been revisited in books, movies, and documentaries. Tubman even had a World War II Liberty ship named after her, the USS Harriet Tubman. In 2016, the United States Treasury announced that Harriet's image will replace that of former president and slave owner Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. The Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, who served under President Trump, later announced the new bill would be delayed until at least 2026. In January of 2021, President Joe Biden's administration announced it would speed up the design process to mint the bill honoring this wonderful woman and her legacy, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman decided that she wanted to be free. Not only did she want to be free, she wanted all her families and friends to be free. So she gave her life on the Underground Railroad to do just that, to go and set them free. On today, as we look around, we still have work to do. We may not need the Underground Railroad, but we need all of us to come together and do the work so that we may be free. This is your midweek moment. Thank you for listening. God bless you. See you next week.